Breaking: Canada just hit back, and Trump wasn't ready for this. 1 minute ago, the entire balance of this confrontation changed. Not tomorrow, not next week, right now. Canada just hit back, and it did not come back with a symbolic protest, a carefully worded complaint, or some quiet diplomatic note designed to buy time. It came back harder, faster, and with far more precision than anyone in Trump's orbit expected. And the shockwave was immediate. Screens lit up, markets jolted, cameras swung toward podiums, adversaries started huddling, allies started making calls, because what just happened is not a routine dispute between neighboring governments. It is the kind of move that tells you a line has been crossed, that the gloves are off, and that what began as political theater may have just turned into a full-scale strategic collision with real economic consequences, real diplomatic fallout, and real political damage. And that is why this matters so much more than the headline. This is not just Trump versus Canada.
This is not just another tariff fight, not just another angry statement, not just another day of nationalist bravado followed by backroom damage control. This is a test of power, leverage, and credibility inside a wider struggle over trade, supply chains, alliance discipline, economic sovereignty, and political intimidation. Because when the United States tries to pressure a close ally, and that ally responds not with fear, but with escalation, the signal goes far beyond the border. The signal is global. The signal is strategic. The signal is this: pressure will now be met with cost. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through what just happened and why it landed like a political thunderclap. I'm going to show you why Canada's response is being seen as stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than the original move it was answering. I'm going to explain how this retaliation actually works and why it hits pressure points that matter politically, economically, and symbolically. I'm going to reveal what is happening behind the scenes, inside Trump's camp, as advisors scramble to contain the fallout. I'm going to break down how markets, industry players, diplomatic allies, and media power centers are reacting in real time. And I'm going to tell you what comes next. Because if you think this story ends with one counterstrike, you are missing the real game completely. And if you value sharp, non-nonsense breakdowns like this, subscribe right now. Because what I'm about to show you is the part most people will not catch until it is too late. This was not just retaliation. This was a message, a direct, strategic message. And once you see how it was constructed, you understand why Trump looked stunned. Here's the immediate event. Trump's side made its move expecting dominance. The premise was familiar: pressure Canada, escalate rhetorically, raise the cost, force a concession, and then frame the whole thing as strength. That is the playbook. Hit hard, define the narrative first, dare the other side to overreact, and assume that because Canada is so economically intertwined with the United States, Ottawa will blink before Washington does. But what happened next shattered that assumption. Canada did not blink. Canada responded with a package designed not just to answer the blow, but to expose the vulnerability behind it. Retaliatory measures, targeted economic pain, threats to redirect trade, strategic use of critical exports, institutional escalation, legal escalation, diplomatic escalation, public escalation, not random, not emotional, surgical. And that tells you everything you need to know, because the problem for Trump is not simply that Canada answered. The problem is how Canada answered. It did not come back on terrain chosen by Trump. It shifted the battlefield. Instead of arguing only on Trump's terms, Canada broadened the confrontation into a question of supply chains, regional stability, industrial dependence, and alliance reliability. That changes everything. When you widen the lens, you force everyone watching to ask a more dangerous question: who actually has leverage here? Let me walk you through the mechanics, because this is where the story gets far more serious than the slogan-level coverage. Canada's response matters because Canada is not just another trading partner on a spreadsheet. It is deeply embedded inside the North American industrial system: energy, auto manufacturing, aluminum, timber, uranium, potash, critical minerals, cross-border logistics, defense cooperation, integrated production lines.
This is not a distant relationship where one side can take a swing and walk away clean. This is a shared machine, and when one side starts pulling hard on the gears, both sides feel it. The only question is who feels it first, who feels it worse, and who gets blamed politically when the pressure becomes visible. That is why the Canadian move is being read as so severe. It appears calibrated to create pain where it can be measured, televised, and weaponized. Not in abstract macroeconomic language, in factories, in commodity markets, in business confidence, in consumer prices, in state-level political pressure, in the industries and constituencies that form the backbone of Trump's economic messaging. That is the counterpunch. Canada is saying, in effect, if you want escalation, then escalation will no longer be a campaign prop. It will become a cost center. And you can already picture the scene. On one side, a tough-talking political machine expecting applause for another show of force. On the other side, a neighboring government stepping to the podium with documents, measures, coordinated messaging, and the cold tone of a country that has decided it will not be publicly pushed around. Cameras clicking, reporters shouting, traders refreshing, corporate lawyers dialing emergency calls, the public hearing the same phrase in different forms across every channel. Canada hit back harder. Now here's what this means. Trump's entire political brand has always depended on the perception that pressure works, that threats create compliance, that allies adjust, that opponents fracture, that blunt force leverage produces visible wins. But when a close ally resists and then retaliates in a way that appears more coherent than the original move, the image changes. Suddenly, strength starts to look like miscalculation, aggression starts to look like overreach, control starts to look like loss of control, and that transition is humiliating, because one of the worst outcomes in high-stakes politics is not just being opposed, it is being exposed. Exposed as having overplayed your hand, exposed as misreading the other side, exposed as triggering a counter-reaction you cannot easily reverse without looking weak. That is the trap, not a policy dispute, but a power struggle, not a trade disagreement, but a test of who can absorb pain, assign blame, and still dominate the narrative. If you're still with me, stay locked in, because the next layer is the one that turns this from a headline into a strategic warning. The visible move is only half the story. The hidden story is coordination. Behind the scenes, this kind of response does not appear out of nowhere. Governments do not build targeted retaliation packages in a panic unless they have already wargamed the scenario. That means Canada was preparing. It means officials had mapped vulnerabilities. It means industry contacts were consulted. It means allied capitals were almost certainly briefed. It means legal teams were ready. It means contingency messaging was drafted, and most importantly, it means Trump's move may have triggered not surprise, but activation. That is a very different picture than the one his camp wanted. They wanted dominance. What they got was a prepared counteroffensive. Think about the internal reaction that must be unfolding right now. Advisors asking how far Canada intends to go. Political staff trying to determine whether this lands as a short-term media battle or a sustained economic problem. Lobbyists flooding offices with warnings about sectoral damage. Business leaders demanding clarity. Allies asking whether this is now a bilateral fight or the beginning of a broader fracture in Western economic coordination. The outer message may still be defiance. The inner mood is something else. Scrambling, recalculation, damage assessment, and Trump being stunned, if that is what we are seeing, is not about the existence of retaliation alone. It is about the intensity of it. It is about the fact that Canada did not simply defend itself. It signaled that it understands where the real leverage points are and is willing to use them. That changes the emotional temperature inside the confrontation. It tells Washington that this will not be resolved by volume, by swagger, or by social media theatrics alone. What happened next only deepened the pressure. Media coverage began shifting from the original Trump move to the Canadian answer. That is a huge narrative loss, because once the story becomes Canada hits back harder, the psychological frame flips. Trump is no longer the actor, he becomes the reactor. He is no longer defining the scene, he is responding to it. And in politics, especially in a confrontation built around perceived strength, that is devastating. It is one thing to launch a fight. It is another to discover that the audience is now watching your opponent's counterpunch in slow motion. The pattern is clear. Canada's move appears designed to achieve three things at once: impose cost, project resolve, and internationalize the stakes. That third part is crucial because if the dispute is seen as a narrow personal clash, Trump can still try to dominate it rhetorically. But if it becomes a wider story about alliance instability, market disruption, industrial insecurity, and reckless brinksmanship, the circle of stakeholders expands dramatically. And that means more pressure points, more critics, more questions, and more ways for the backlash to compound. Let me give you three implications, because this is where the larger meaning comes into focus. First, this exposes the myth of effortless leverage. For years, the turns out vaping either style of power politics has been simple. America is bigger, therefore America can always impose the terms. But size is not the same as control, not when supply chains are integrated, not when energy flows are interconnected, not when key materials cross borders every day, not when political pain can be redirected back into the domestic arena. Canada's response is a reminder that in an interconnected system, smaller actors can still create severe pressure if they know where dependence lives. That is the first implication. Brute force is not always strategic force. Second, this raises the political cost inside the United States, and that matters enormously. If retaliation touches prices, production timelines, business confidence, or jobs in sectors sensitive to political messaging, the White House line or campaign line becomes harder to hold. Supporters may cheer the rhetoric, markets do not, manufacturers do not, logistics networks do not, investors do not, governors do not, governors do not. If this escalates, the question inside America quickly becomes, what exactly was gained here, and why are we paying for it now? That is where confidence erodes, quietly at first, then all at once. Third, this changes how other countries interpret Trump-style pressure. That may be the biggest consequence of all, because if Canada can resist visibly and impose meaningful cost, others are watching, allies are watching, rivals are watching, trading partners are watching, institutions are watching. They are all trying to answer the same question: does confrontation with Trump inevitably lead to capitulation, or can structured resistance work? Canada's move, by the look of it, is trying to answer that question in public, and if the answer becomes yes, resistance works, then the strategic aura around Trump's approach weakens beyond this one dispute. That is why this feels historic, not because every trade fight is historic, most are not, but because some moments reveal the architecture beneath the conflict. This one does. This one shows the pressure system. This one shows the dependencies. This one shows the limits of intimidation when the target decides the cost of surrender is higher than the cost of fighting back. Now let's talk about reactions, because reactions tell you where the real fear is. Markets hate uncertainty, but they fear escalation even more when it involves integrated economies. Corporate boardrooms hate political theater when it starts threatening procurement schedules, inventory planning, and long-term investment decisions. Diplomats hate public fights between close partners because they know once trust breaks at the top, secondary files begin to rot underneath it. Defense officials hate economic warfare among allies because industrial capacity and strategic coordination are not separate universes anymore. They overlap. They bleed into one another. That overlap is where crises get dangerous. And then there is the media reaction. Some outlets will frame this as mere retaliation. Others will frame it as a humiliating setback for Trump. But beneath the spin, the deeper consensus is emerging. Canada did not just answer. It escalated intelligently. It found a way to turn asymmetry into leverage. And that is why the tone feels different tonight. More serious, more brutal, more consequential. The problem for Trump now is that every option comes with cost. If he escalates again, he risks deepening the economic and diplomatic damage, validating Canada's strategy, and pushing the crisis into a self-sustaining spiral. If he softens or backs down, he risks looking cornered after projecting dominance.
If he tries to dismiss the retaliation as meaningless while businesses start warning about fallout, he risks looking detached from reality. That is the definition of a no-win dynamic. And those are the most dangerous dynamics in politics because leaders trapped between image management and material consequences often make worse decisions in order to avoid admitting the first mistake. And let's be honest about the emotional layer here. This is not only about policy, it never is. It is about pride, theater, authority, and public humiliation. Trump thrives on the image of forcing outcomes. Canada's response threatens that image directly. It says, your pressure is not decisive, your threat is not final, your move can be answered, and worse, it can be answered in a way that makes you look unprepared. That is a brutal message, and yet the biggest revelation may still be ahead, because once retaliation begins, the next phase is not the headline.
The next phase is the chain reaction. What do companies do tomorrow morning? What do provincial leaders say? What do U.S. governors say? What happens if industry groups start demanding exemptions, carve-outs, or reversal? What happens if other allies quietly align with Canada's position? What happens if the dispute spills beyond tariffs into procurement, investment screening, energy coordination, border operations, or institutional complaints? That is how limited fights become severe fights. That is how symbolic clashes become structural crises. Here's what this reveals strategically. Canada appears to understand that in a modern confrontation, you do not need to overpower your opponent in size. You need to disrupt the illusion that they alone control escalation. Once that illusion breaks, everything changes. The other side has to start calculating instead of dictating. They have to think about second-order effects, coalition reactions, domestic backlash, and timing. They have to manage uncertainty they themselves created. That is not victory in a formal sense, but it is leverage, real leverage. And leverage is the real currency here. Not speeches, not slogans, not chest thumping. Leverage. Who has it? Who thought they had it? Who just lost some of it? And who is now using it with cold precision? Let me be even more direct. This is a warning shot against the politics of assumed submission. For too long, the underlying bet has been that allies, especially tightly integrated allies, will always choose stability over confrontation, even if they are publicly insulted, economically pressured, or strategically cornered. Canada just challenged that premise in the most public way possible. It is saying stability does not mean surrender. Partnership does not mean obedience. Interdependence cuts both ways. That phrase matters. Interdependence cuts both ways. Because if that idea starts shaping the next stage of this crisis, then Trump's opening move may be remembered not as the start of a successful pressure campaign, but as the trigger for a wider backlash that exposed the limits of his leverage model. And once a model is exposed, it becomes harder to use it again with the same force. People adapt, markets adapt, the aura weakens. So what happens next? Scenario 1. Rapid de-escalation talks begin quietly. Both sides try to claim victory, and the public rhetoric remains fierce, while negotiators look for an off-ramp. That would be the rational path. But rational paths are not always politically available when egos are involved and cameras are rolling. Scenario 2. Controlled escalation. More announcements, more retaliation, more sector-specific pain, more media warfare, more late-night meetings, more attempts to force a climb down without saying the word climb down. This is the most likely path in a confrontation driven by image and leverage.
Scenario 3. The dangerous spiral. Markets wobble harder. Industry pressure intensifies. Allies begin choosing sides or demanding stabilization. The dispute expands beyond its original scope. At that point, what looked like a headline fight becomes a broader crisis of economic coordination and political judgment. That is the scenario every serious operator wants to avoid, because once you get there, off-ramps become expensive and mistakes become irreversible. And this is why the moment feels so heavy, because beneath the slogans, beneath the outraged press statements, beneath the inevitable partisan spin, there is a much colder reality setting in. Canada has shown it is willing to impose consequences. Trump now has to decide whether he can absorb them, reverse them, or out-escalate them without detonating the larger relationship and without taking visible political damage at home. That is another corridor very narrow. This is the point casual viewers miss. They see two governments arguing, they see nationalist language, they see the familiar drama, but the deeper reality is that this is a contest over who gets to define the cost of conflict. And tonight, Canada just intervened in that contest with force, not performative force, strategic force, the kind that changes calculations and rooms you will never see. So yes, call it dramatic, call it extraordinary, call it humiliating for Trump if you want, but above all, call it what it is, a counterstrike that landed, a hard one, a visible one, a politically dangerous one. And the reason it matters is simple. Once a supposedly weaker player proves it can hit back even harder, the entire hierarchy of the confrontation starts to wobble. That is what you are watching right now. Not a routine disagreement, but a rupture. Not a policy spat, but a live test of power. Not an isolated event, but a turning point in how this kind of pressure politics gets answered. Trump made a move expecting compliance. Canada answered with consequences. And now the burden of control has shifted. Now the pressure is different. Now the room is colder. Now the next decision is harder. And that may end up being the real disaster here. Because in the end, the most devastating political moments are not the loudest. They're the moments when a leader realizes the script has been taken out of his hands, when the other side sees the initiative, when the bluff has been called. When the machinery of retaliation starts moving and when the world watches and understands before he does that this is no longer his stage, Canada just made that point in the hardest possible way. Trump wanted a show of strength. What he got was a strategic rebuke. He wanted pressure without price. He got price without control. He wanted the last word. Instead, he got the most dangerous thing a power player can get in a public confrontation: proof that the other side is not afraid, not backing down, and not finished. This is bigger than a headline, bigger than a soundbite, bigger than one clash. This is what it looks like when pressure meets resistance, and resistance turns into leverage. And tonight, that leverage snapped back.